the movie Paid in Full became a cult classic for the crime genre, and the main characters became familiar stars for the public interested in the history of crime. Alpo Martinez, Azie Faison, and Rich Porter are men whose destinies epitomize the three paths a person can take in the world of drug trafficking. And since Alpo's path was the longest and most complicated, we would tell the real story of Harlem's criminal legends through his lens. Meet Albert Alpo Martinez on the other side of the law. Albert Alpo Martinez was born June 8, 1966 in East Harlem. Alpo grew up without a father, but his mother did her best to keep her son away from the influence of the streets. She introduced her son to different circles and areas, and he often went to summer camps. Albert also participated in a social program which gave children from disadvantaged neighborhoods a chance to live in well-to-do foster families for a while. For several years, he traveled to the Clinton family every summer. This family later characterized Albert as a strikingly polite and well-behaved child. The mother was sincerely worried about the fate of her son. On her initiative, Martinez for some time even seriously intended to join the army. He was accepted into the rank of cadet, but the military never worked out. Over the years, it became increasingly difficult for his mother to feed the family, and therefore, young Albert soon had to say goodbye to dreams of a military career. From now on, his teacher was the street. To earn some money, he started committing petty crimes with his friends. 13-year-old Albert began breaking into unattended cars in search of valuables. Soon, the boys became involved in selling heroin, which they purchased from a local dealer. Alpo, now 15, made his first good profit and was first talked about in East Harlem, but he was soon arrested. This came as a shock to his mother, who contacted a family that Albert had previously visited to take him in again. The mother hoped that the time away from Harlem would help her son return to a law-abiding lifestyle. When Alpo arrived, the Clintons noticed that Albert had changed. He was no longer the quiet child he had been before. Alpo now preferred bright and flashy jewelry as well as expensive clothes and sneakers. Albert looked much older than his peers, who recognized him as a leader and followed him everywhere. Returning home to Harlem in the summer of 1981, Alpo got together with drug dealer Randy Love. Together, they began to develop plans to rob large Colombian and Dominican drug traffickers. It is worth noting that Albert was Puerto Rican by nationality, but because of the color of his skin, almost everyone around him mistook him for an African American. Therefore, according to Randy's plan, Alpo was to come to the drug dealers pretending to be a small-time dealer who was interested in buying a small amount of goods. Also, Alpo was supposed to conceal that he was fluent in Spanish, listen to other people's conversations, and try to find out where the dealers kept their money and drugs. He would then buy a small shipment and return to Randy, to whom he would tell everything he had learned. Randy and his crew would then raid the joint. These raids were good money, but Alpo wanted more. With his savings of $10,000, he bought a shipment of cocaine and, with the help of his friends, started dealing. However, the guys did not have a regular supplier, so it often happened that the buyers left with nothing. Therefore, Alpo decided to offer to work with a more prominent dealer named Azie Faison. Azie Faison was born on November 10, 1964. His childhood was spent in a large family. He had 6 siblings. The first years of his life were spent in the Bronx, but in 1970, there was a fire in the house where his family lived and they had to move. The Faison family's new home was in the infamous Sugar Hill neighborhood in Harlem. At the age of 15, Faison dropped out of high school. At that time, he had not yet gotten involved with bad company and left school only to work full-time instead of just a few hours left after school. Azie got a job at a dry cleaner shop that was located in the same neighborhood. Faison thought that he would earn substantially more by working full-time at the dry cleaners, but he was wrong. His salary of $75 a week was only slightly more than what he had earned before. Azie tried to make the best of it. On Sundays, when Harlem was alcohol-free, he sold counterfeit liquor. Faison managed to increase his income to $150, but it was still not enough money to live on. In 1983, Azie saw a movie that made a big impression on him. It was Scarface with Al Pacino in the title role. The image of the main character, Tony Montana, etched into the soul of a 19-year-old boy, and he decided to become a drug dealer. In this, he was helped by chance. as was shown in the movie Paid in Full. When they sorted out the dirty clothes of customers at work, Faison found a small bag of cocaine in his pants pocket. It belonged to a local drug dealer named Lulu. Azie tried to return the drugs to the owner, but the owner thanked him for his honesty and told him to keep the drugs he found. Faison sold them and a few days later returned to Lulu with the money already for a new batch of cocaine. Azie himself said in an interview that his acquaintance with Lulu was not as it is depicted in the movie. They actually lived near each other and met in a local billiard room. In any case, whatever their acquaintance was, Azie got lucky with the dealer. The cocaine he brought from Lulu was of very high quality, purer than what other dealers in Harlem offered. Azie sold the product at a lower price than his competitors, and customers who appreciated the pureness of the product went to him again and again. Lulu appreciated his young partner and eventually began allowing him to take as much cocaine for sale as he saw fit. Azie realized it was dangerous to keep the product in his home, so he turned to an acquaintance nicknamed Gangster Lou and his mother, who for $700 a month agreed to store his cocaine in their home and help with its packaging. Thanks to their help, Faison began making about $50,000 a week. In the same neighborhood, Faison bought an empty space and set up a slot machine room there. In his service rooms, Azie could safely hide money and drugs. The place later became known as Jukebox. It was a real gold mine, bringing its owner several tens of thousands of dollars per week. Alpo did not seek a roundabout approach to Faison, but simply drove up to him on the street on his motorcycle and offered to do business together. Azie had heard next to nothing about Alpo at the time and told him he would contact him after a couple weeks. During that time, he made inquiries about Alpo to his comrade Rich Porter, who was in prison then serving a sentence for firearms possession. Porter told Faison that he had made a few deals with Alpo when he was free and he could be trusted. Azie listened to his friend's opinion and took Martinez onto his team. Alpo had been dealing drugs for a while, and sometimes at Faison's request, he delivered to dealers, but it wasn't at the scale he had wanted. Alpo waited for a chance to move up, and soon he got it. Jukebox was generating a good income, but even more problems. It had even gotten to the point where a gang of local teenagers had robbed the place several times. Faison didn't know how he should behave in this situation. He was against harsh measures and didn't want to shed blood, but the robberies continued. At one point, Azie was even going to sell the premises back to the previous owners, but then decided to give it to Alpo. What other members of the team saw as a burden, Martinez saw as an opportunity to prove himself. Alpo found out where a group of teenage robbers often gathered and attacked them with his men. They were taken by surprise and 2 of them were killed, and that's how Alpo got his spot. Soon, Rich Porter got out and they started working together, Alpo, Azie and Rich. It didn't last long though. Faison's sister was dating a local drug dealer named Kevin Clark, yet their affair didn't last as Clark soon went to prison. After he was released from prison, he found out about his ex-girlfriend's brother's dealings and asked Faison to take him on board. He not only agreed to help him, but for some time he took him under his wing, bought him a car and gave him $15,000. On August 21st, 1987, Azie was playing basketball with friends when one of his sellers approached and told him that they were running out of merchandise. One of Azie's stashes was in his aunt's apartment, so after calling and warning her of his visit, he went with a friend and an acquaintance to get the cocaine. After Azie entered his aunt's apartment, he was attacked by armed men. Faison was beaten and told he had to hand over the money and drugs stored in his safe. Azie recognized one of the robbers. It was Kevin. When Azie said he knew him, the man ripped off his mask and hit him over the head with a gun. The blow left Azie's face covered in blood and he was unable to open the safe. Faison said he only kept change in the safe, but he had $300,000 at home. The robbers decided they would go with Faison to his home. Kevin took him to the bathroom to clean up, but at that point, Faison's aunt started yelling at him not to leave. The attackers were on edge, so one of them shot her. Upon hearing the gunshots, Azie pounced onto Kevin, who had been watching him in the bathroom. Faison was able to overpower him in the fight and get out of the bathroom, but the moment he got out, he was shot 9 times by another robber. Faison lost consciousness, and when he woke up, he saw that his aunt and her guests were dead and the friend and girlfriend he had come with were critically wounded. Faison was rushed to the hospital. He was a hair's breadth from death. 2 bullets had grazed his head, one hit his neck, and 2 more bullets were removed from his legs by doctors. Journalists dubbed that robbery the Bronx Massacre. The robbers were soon caught and sentenced to life in prison. When Azie recovered, a police detective came to his room and told him that law enforcement knew what he was doing. After being discharged from hospital, he met with his business partners and told them he was going to get out of the game. Alpo tried to change his friend's mind, saying that the hard times were temporary, but Faison was adamant. While Azie decided to leave the drug trade to focus on his music career, Alpo and Rich were determined to take it to the next level. They were able to adapt to the changes that had taken place in the market. They were now dealing crack cocaine and earning several times more than before. Martinez's ex-girlfriend later recalled that he would bring home several garbage bags full of cash every night and ask her and her sister to count the proceeds. Porter began doing business with Richard Fritz Simmons, who was rumored to have ties with the Lucchese crime family and received almost unlimited quantities from the Dominican Republic and Colombia. Alpo, however, wanted to expand his drug empire, so in early 1988, he and his girlfriend Karen went to live with her parents in Washington, D.C. Even before entering a relationship with Martinez, Karen had already met with some drug dealers from Washington, so she knew all the places in the city where she could get the right connections. Karen introduced Martinez to the right people, including Curtis Chambers, nicknamed Kurtbone, who was one of DC's biggest drug dealers. Kurtbone began purchasing product from Martinez. Alpo also began doing business with drug dealer Garrett Terrell, nicknamed Big Head Harry. The drug trade in DC was very profitable, buying cocaine in New York at a price of $18,000 per kilogram and spending 5 hours on the road to the American capital. He then sold it in Washington for $21,000. Soon, there were major changes in Washington, D.C. In April 1989, the court sentenced 24-year-old Rayful Edmond to life in prison. Edmond was the largest drug trafficker in the city, a man who stocked almost the entire district with crack. Along with Rayful, many of his associates, including Curtis Chambers, were also docked. Chambers introduced Martinez to hitman Shelton Watkins, nicknamed Shorty Pop, after his incarceration. Shelton had once been a good musician. At the age of 13, he had been a member of the go-go band Junkyard Band, which later played for groups such as the Beastie Boys and Slayer, but then traded his music career for a gun, committing his first murder at the age of 15. It was Watkins who had told Alpo about an acquaintance who was in prison at the time, but who he said could be useful to them. The man in question was Wayne Silk Perry, Washington's deadliest hitman. The judge set the bail amount at $100,000, but Perry didn't have that kind of money back then. The amount was later reduced to $10,000, but even that amount no one was in a hurry to pay. On Shelton's advisement, Alpo posted bail and Wayne was released. At first, Alpo did not disturb Perry, allowing him to go about his business. He only asked Shelton to tell Wayne exactly who'd bailed him out. It wasn't long before the investment paid off. One fall evening in 1989, Martinez went to a deal with a buyer he barely knew, and it almost cost him his life. Alpo was shot at and only miraculously managed to survive and escape. Martinez ended up in the hospital where doctors, he said, thought he would not make it. Martinez even managed to get a visit from a detective who was going to find out who shot him. Alpo, thinking his days were numbered, told the police officer that he was in the drug trade and that he believed the shooters were from Virginia. But when the detectives returned to the hospital the next day to see if Martinez had survived, he was gone. After recovering from his wounds, Alpo left the hospital. Martinez was furious. In all the time he had spent in DC, he had never given anyone a reason to kill him. Martinez had tried to be friendly. He often lent money to dealers he knew, took the time to pay them back, and they had answered him with lead. Alpo decided it was time to change his approach to business, and now he needed the help of his enforcers. Wayne Perry was tasked with finding and killing those behind the fall assassination attempt, and Shelton Watkins was to deal with Matthew Blake, a drug dealer and potential rival of Alpo's in Southeast DC. Wayne and Shelton performed their assignments brilliantly. Martinez's next victim was the man he once called his brother, Rich Porter. The reason for the murder, according to Alpo, was that Rich began selling him cocaine at a higher price than before. Porter attributed the increase in price to the fact that his suppliers did not always have the amount of cocaine they needed and therefore had to raise the price tag. For a while, Martinez was satisfied with this explanation, but one day while passing through Harlem, he met a drug dealer who occasionally sold his product to Rich. Alpo talked to him about the too high price for the goods, to which his companion replied with surprise that there was no problem with the cocaine and that last week Porter had purchased almost 100 kilos of the drugs. Martinez asked him to describe what the cocaine packaging looked like. He had recently purchased from Porter at an inflated price a shipment of cocaine that had the name of the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, on each brick. The drug dealer said he sold Porter the cocaine in just such a package. Martinez listened carefully to his companion and asked him not to tell Rich yet about their conversation. On the way back to Washington, Alpo plunged into mathematical calculations. It turned out that Rich had defrauded him of several $100,000. Back home, Martinez told Terrell. Harry offered to kill Porter, but Alpo refused. He couldn't believe that the man he considered his brother could do this to him, and so he decided to give him another chance. Martinez called Rich and asked him where he had purchased the last shipment of cocaine, since it was in tremendous demand in Washington, D.C., he said. Porter replied that he had purchased it from Richard Simmons. At this point, Martinez realized that Porter was lying to him. Martinez was going to travel to New York again, this time to meet and discuss all the burning issues with Porter in person. Alpo told Terrell that if Rich lied to him this time, he would kill him. But before Martinez could get on the road, he got a call from Porter himself. Rich begged Alpo to come as soon as possible. On December 5th, 1989, tragedy struck the Porter family. His 12-year-old younger brother, Donnell Porter, was kidnapped on his way to school. The kidnappers contacted the family of the child and demanded that they pay them $500,000. To prove their intentions, the kidnappers left a coffee can in the restroom of a local McDonald's that contained the child's severed finger, Donnell's ring, and an audio tape of little Porter crying and begging his family to pay the ransom. Porter did not have the full amount needed at the time, but his supplier Richard Simmons came to the rescue and handed him 30 kilos of cocaine. Porter asked Alpo to buy at least part of the product from him urgently in order to raise at least half of the requested amount. There were too many feds in Harlem looking for the kidnapped child, and therefore it was impossible to sell all 30 kilos in a short period of time. On the evening of January 3rd, 1990, Martinez and Terrell drove to Harlem where they met Porter. For a long time, their conversation revolved around the Donnell situation, but then Alpo asked Rich where he was actually buying the merchandise. Rich repeated what he'd said on the phone. Alpo looked at the rearview mirror and nodded his head to Terrell, who was sitting in the back seat. He shot Porter twice in the head. The killers drove around the neighborhood in the car with the body for about an hour before they dumped Porter's body near Orchard Beach in the Bronx. Even though the murder was certainly discreet enough, the neighborhood still figured out who was behind Rich's death by circumstantial evidence. A few weeks later, the Porter family faced another disaster. A homeless man discovered the body of the kidnapped Donnell. The site where the child's body was found was only 1 mile from Orchard Beach, where Rich's body had recently been discovered. Apparently, upon learning of Porter's death, the kidnappers realized they could not get their ransom and killed the kid. One of the kidnappers turned out to be Donnell's own uncle, John Porter. He was part of a group commanded by Clarence Preacher Heatley, a sadist and extortionist who kidnapped, tortured, and murdered people. John Porter was not on the best of terms with Rich. He watched as he bathed in luxury while his own pockets were often empty. It was then that he came up with a plan to kidnap his nephew. After his arrest, John Porter began to cooperate with the investigation and was eventually sentenced to 30 years in prison. Alpo Martinez left New York City for many years afterward. He could not return to his hometown now, as many people there considered him guilty for the death of everyone's favorite guy and wished him dead. So he decided to concentrate on business in Washington, D.C. And in Washington, Martinez caused a real bloodbath. In the summer of 1990, Alpo ordered Wayne to kill 2 rival drug dealers. The dealers were selling their product in Potomac Gardens, a neighborhood in southeast D.C. Perry didn't go on the job alone. He was accompanied by one of the young fighters, Calvin Smith. They approached the men from behind and shot them in the heads before calmly proceeding to their car. This murder took place in front of several eyewitnesses, some of whom later agreed to testify. Soon, the police managed to arrest Calvin Smith, but they faced an unforeseen problem. The witnesses, as well as Calvin himself, refused to mention Wayne Perry's name in their testimony. The lawmen were well aware that Smith was only the second shooter, but they could not prove it. This eventually led to the double murder charges against Calvin being dropped. In the fall of that same year, 1990, in broad daylight and in front of a large crowd of witnesses, Wayne Perry shot and killed James Frog Henderson. None of the many witnesses to the crime wanted to talk to police officers for fear of losing their lives. However, one brave eyewitness was found, James's girlfriend, Alvetta Penny Hopkins. Detectives informed her that the police would do everything to protect her, but they were mistaken. In the summer of 1991, Alvetta was kidnapped by Alpo Martinez's men. Some sources say that one of Wayne Perry's subordinates purposely hit the girl with a van while she was walking. Alvetta lost consciousness and woke up in the van. Wayne turned up the NWA group's track "A Bitch is a Bitch" at full volume and then began stabbing her in the face and arms. He then pulled out a gun and shot the wounded girl several times. Her body was found by bystanders in an alley. The duo of Alpo and Perry continued to terrorize the neighborhood. Shortly after the murder of Alvetta Hopkins in the summer of 1991, Alpo Martinez had a conflict with an old acquaintance, a gangster he knew from New York, Domencio Montana Benson. The reason for the conflict, according to Martinez, was that Domencio had insulted his girlfriend. Alpo discussed the situation with Domencio and the two sides seemed to reach a compromise. Once upon a time, Alpo often went to play against Domencio on the basketball courts in New York. To bring the conflict to a close, Martinez suggested that Benson reminisce about the old days and play a little ball. He agreed. During the game, Martinez extended his hand to Domencio for a handshake. Benson shook his hand, after which Alpo nodded his head to Shelton Watkins, who was nearby. Watkins then drew his gun and shot Benson. As in the case of Rich Porter, Martinez sent the victim's family a lavish bouquet of flowers for the funeral. Soon, it was Michael Frey Salter's turn. By the time Martinez moved to Washington, D.C., Salters was already at the top of the city's criminal hierarchy. He had been involved in some of the bloodiest street wars Washington ever knew, but his strongest quality was his ability to peacefully resolve conflicts and turf disputes between rival drug dealers. He was respected, feared, and loved all at the same time. Salters was also not very fond of the visitors from New York. The fact is that transfers from New York to Washington were usually not the nation's brightest stars, but more often than not were the most undesired, who didn't have a place even in their hometown. The newcomers violated the established order. They traded drugs at lower prices, invaded foreign territory, killed local gangsters, and then disappeared just as suddenly as they appeared. Then who had to restore order in the city? Frey, of course. When Alpo came to Washington, Frey immediately checked him out with some people he knew in New York, and he didn't like what he heard. Barely after moving to Washington, Alpo tried to befriend Frey but was not successful. Michael directly told Martinez that everyone would be better off if he left DC. Once Alpo even arranged with Michael to sell 10 kilograms of cocaine, but when Martinez arrived for a meeting, Frey beat him up and took away the goods. Martinez remembered the incident for a long time. Michael also disliked Wayne Perry. A few months after the cocaine deal, Martinez learned that Frey had promised a large sum of money to whoever could shoot Perry. After discussing the situation with Wayne, he decided that Frey should be killed. But since it was very difficult to get close to him, it was decided that one of Michael's own team members would do it. Salters had a man named Michael Jackson on his team who sometimes took cocaine from Frey to sell. Salters did not take Jackson seriously, often mocking him because of the way he dressed. One day, the drug dealer failed to pay Salters on time and the latter demanded that he find the money within a few days. This became known to Alpo, who offered Jackson $9,000 and half a kilo of cocaine in exchange for Salters' elimination. He also promised Jackson that he would take him on as a member of his team upon successful completion of the assignment. Jackson arranged a meeting with Frey Salters. On July 16, 1991, while Salters was waiting for Jackson in his car, a masked man approached him and shot him 6 times. A nearby relative managed to take the wounded Frey to the hospital, but he died of his wounds hours later. No one could stop the violence that Martinez had started. 5 days after the killing of Michael Salters, a 20-year-old girl named Evelyn Carter was murdered. She had quite a striking appearance and liked to spend time in the company of big-time drug dealers and gangsters from Washington. This girl very much liked Wayne, however she rejected all his advances. Perry took her refusal as a sign of disrespect and came up with a plan to get back at her. He went to Alpo and told him that Evelyn Carter, in his opinion, was a police informant. In response, Martinez gave Perry the command to get rid of her. Perry decided that Evelyn would not be killed by him personally, but by a rookie on his team, Thomas Dozier. The killer tracked down Carter as she was returning from a concert with a group of friends. Dozier shot her twice in the chest and fled. Friends of the victim called an ambulance, but by the time the paramedics arrived, Evelyn was already dead. When Dozier came to Perry and told him how it had gone, he was furious that Thomas had not fired a follow-up shot to the head. Perry had always taught his subordinates that the best way to kill someone for sure was to shoot them in the head. Wanting to demonstrate the lesson in practice, Perry approached the phone booth where an unsuspecting man was talking. Wayne shot him in the head and then turned to Dozier and said that was the only way to be sure you had killed someone. A negligent student, Perry didn't like Thomas Dozier right away. He decided that in the future, he could become a burden and bring on a lot of problems. In addition, Wayne believed that Dozier might be cooperating with the feds. He discussed the situation with Alpo and they decided to get rid of Dozier. Martinez and Perry spread the rumor that he was the killer of Michael Salters. There were still many Frey supporters on the street who were averse to avenging him. The nephew of the murdered man, Darryl Salters, also known as Poochie, was especially eager for revenge. He was very close to his uncle and considered him his mentor. Darryl tracked Dozier down near his home in southeast Washington, D.C. and shot him in cold blood with an AK-47, firing a full clip into him. There was no chance of surviving, even for those who benefited Alpo. One such victim was a well-known drug dealer in town, Andre Tank Johnson. He purchased several $100,000 worth of cocaine from Martinez every month. At one of the spot parties, Andre met Harry Terrell's girlfriend. Sympathy arose between the young pair and they began sleeping together. Perhaps it would have remained a little secret between the two lovers, but during one quarrel, the girl confessed to cheating on Terrell. He went into a rage and told everything to Martinez. Terrell and Martinez set Andre up with a meeting under the guise of a deal, to which he arrived with almost $300,000. Alpo was discussing the purchase with him when Terrell ran up to the car and shot Andre. As Johnson's business companion, Ears the Christ, later recalled, this deal was to be their last, after which they were going to quit the drug trade and move to California to start a music label. Ears always accompanied Andre to meetings with Alpo, but that time he decided to do everything on his own. Besides, shortly before the meeting, he had broken up with Terrell's girlfriend and thought he had nothing to fear. Martinez, in the interview he gave in prison, said that everything happened by accident and he did not give Terrell permission to kill Andre. However, given the fact that they arrived to the meeting in the van that Alpo's team used for murders, one has to doubt the sincerity of Martinez's words. Alpo himself came out of this situation victorious. He not only appropriated the money and offered the opportunity to avenge his friend, but also was the first to call the victim's girlfriend to comfort her. She soon became Martinez's mistress. A few weeks after Johnson's murder, it was Harry's turn. According to Alpo, Terrell was jealous of him and was going to kill him during the deal to take his money. This was told to him by Perry, who had gotten this information from his acquaintances in Lawton Prison. So Alpo and Perry decided to kill Terrell. One night, Martinez called him and told him that he had accidentally met the guys who had had a conflict with Harry a month before. Now he was going to find them to get even. Martinez and Wayne picked up Harry and began driving around looking for him. As Terrell dozed off, Alpo looked in the rearview mirror and nodded his head, a tentative signal to Wayne, who drew his gun and shot Harry in the head. The dead man's body was left in the woods near the highway, where it was found the next day by telephone company employees. It wasn't necessary to do business with Alpo and Perry to be among their victims. In September 1991, a 24-year-old woman named Yolanda Burley, who worked as a secretary at a law firm, happened to meet Wayne Perry at a party. Eager to get to know him and strike up a conversation, she began asking him questions about what he did for a living and where he had lived before. Perry assumed this conversation companion was a police officer and told his partner Alpo. On September 24, 1991, Yolanda's body was found with several bullet holes on the side of the highway. Alpo and Wayne felt they were the real masters of the town. However, the feds were getting close. On November 8, 1991, around 2 a.m., Albert was talking to his girlfriend while sitting in a car. A man walked past it who seemed suspicious. Pulling out 2 handguns, Alpo wanted to follow the nighttime passerby. But the moment he opened the car door, a police car with its lights on pulled up beside him. Albert ordered his girlfriend, who was behind the wheel, to go immediately. The girl pressed the gas pedal to the fullest, but they were not destined to leave. One of the FBI agents managed to run to the car and pull out Alpo's companion through the side window. Albert attempted to climb over the steering wheel, but another agent put a gun to his head. At the police station, as the detainees were being photographed, a photographer asked Alpo to smile for a picture. Martinez gladly complied with the request. Even after his arrest, he believed he could fend off any accusations against him. He was taken to a jail in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and Wayne Perry, upon learning that his partner had been arrested, immediately contacted his acquaintances at the jail and asked them to keep an eye on Alpo. Martinez was soon transferred to a jail that was located in Washington, D.C. There, he was finally able to speak with his lawyer and get an idea of what might lie ahead. Alpo was charged with multiple drug-related charges, conspiracy to commit murder, and 14 murders, 4 in New York, 2 in Maryland, and 8 in D.C. The prosecution would push for the death penalty or at least life in prison. A lawyer told Martinez that the feds had plenty of evidence at their disposal, but they also wanted information from him that would lead to the rest of his team, most notably Wayne Perry. Hoping to mitigate his sentence, Alpo began cooperating with the feds. Just as he had recently discussed drug deals with business associates, Martinez began negotiating with federal agents, trying to figure out what he could get in return for his information. In early 1993, Alpo contacted a member of his team, Tyrone Price. Martinez told him to retrieve several guns previously used in murders from his van and hide them in a safe place. Alpo was able to convince Tyrone that he was supposedly trying to confuse the feds. However, it was actually a trap. As soon as Tyrone showed up near the van, he was immediately arrested. The van itself was confiscated and a forensic examination was conducted in its interior. The experts found many fingerprints and traces of different blood types there. This indicated that many murders had been committed inside the vehicle. The unassuming van made such an imposing impression on the police that they nicknamed it the Death Van. A short time later, Wayne Perry was caught. He got arrested for selling drugs to an undercover cop. Despite the seemingly minor charge, Wayne realized that things were not that simple with this arrest. Perry had hoped that Alpo would not cooperate with the authorities, but he was mistaken. Alpo had given the feds exhaustive information on the criminal episodes in which Wayne had been a participant. He was soon charged with several murders. The prosecution seriously considered the death penalty, but Wayne agreed to plead guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He is serving his sentence at Florence Supermax Federal Prison. FBI officials investigating Wayne Perry wanted to conduct an examination to see if his psychological profile fit the mold of a serial killer. But since all of Perry's crimes were drug-related and implied a self-serving motive, the idea was abandoned. Dan Riley, an FBI agent who visited Wayne in prison, later recalled that during one of the conversations, Perry admitted that he had actually committed more than 100 murders. It is difficult to determine whether Perry was a serial killer in the classic sense, but one thing is certain, Wayne Perry hates Alpo Martinez to this day. He considers his former business partner a coward who betrayed his most loyal people to save his own skin. Wayne berates himself for not immediately recognizing the rat in Alpo. Even though his testimony helped put Perry behind bars, Martinez still received a lengthy prison sentence. Ironically, he had to serve his sentence in the same prison as Perry. During this incarceration in the late 1990s, he managed to talk to his old friend Azie Faison, who he hadn't spoken to in years. Faison at the time was writing a script for a movie in which he wanted to tell the whole truth about his youth, and he needed to discuss some things with Alpo. First of all, to find out why he shot Rich Porter. A mutual contact in touch with Martinez relayed Azie's request to him, and the conversation took place. In a dialogue with his old friend, Alpo said he never had any personal animosity towards the murdered man and had killed him solely for the money. The movie Paid in Full was released in 2002. It did not manage to collect a large profit at the box office, but over time it has received cult status. Martinez spent 25 years in prison. In 2015, he was released and entered the Witness Protection Program. Martinez spent the next few years living in Lewiston, Maine, where he worked as a construction worker. Neighbors and acquaintances described the former drug dealer as a remarkably pleasant man whose smile never left his face and who was always ready to help. But Alpo continued to miss his past. He thought back to the days when his name had rattled around Harlem. Martinez decided he was tired of hiding his real identity and left witness protection in 2017. He began giving frequent and enjoyable interviews and visiting the sites of his former fame. In one interview, Alpo spoke about the Porter murder while at the very place where the murder took place. Some people cheered his return back home. In their eyes, Martinez was a winner who was able to restart his life with a clean slate. In Harlem, he was often seen taking pictures with fans, but there were many who thought he was a snitch. Alpo did not consider himself a traitor, saying that on the streets there is no code of honor, and anyone would have done the same in his place. Sometimes there were rumors that Alpo returned to the drug trade, but he always denied it. He attributed his lavish lifestyle and expensive purchases to the fact that he had obtained a license to drive trucks. All ties to crime, according to Martinez, he had left in the distant past. In late September 2021, Martinez was involved in a minor traffic accident on his motorcycle. While driving through Harlem, he nearly crashed into a car driven by 27-year-old Shaquem Parker. According to Shaquem, Alpo was being extremely rude, trying to make him look like he was responsible for the situation. Parker felt insulted and decided to take revenge on his aggressor. Since Martinez often posted party videos on social media, it wasn't a problem for any of his followers to know where he was spending his time and when. On the night of October 31st, 2021, Alpo went to the Legends Lounge Club for a Halloween party. There, Martinez took some photos that he posted on Instagram. Around 4 a.m., he left the club and got behind the wheel of his vehicle. As the former drug dealer was about to hit the road, a man approached the driver's side window and fired 5 shots from a handgun. Martinez was shot in the chest and arm, but despite this, was able to start the car and drive away. It was alleged that on the way, trying to get rid of his stash, he threw out rolls of heroin from the window, but the investigation later denied it. His trip was not a long one. Martinez only managed to drive a couple of blocks before he lost control and crashed into another car parked near the sidewalk. By the time police and paramedics arrived, Alpo was still alive. He was transported to the hospital but died shortly after arriving. Alpo Martinez's death was all over the news. Obituaries dedicated to the memory of the man could be seen on social media, but there were also those who took Alpo's death as an excuse to pop champagne. Richie Porter's niece told reporters she was happy to hear the death of her favorite uncle's killer.